China, more than any other country in the world, has a very long history. We go back more than 5,000 years. What I exclude before 1271 is really important stuff. First paper currency in the world, gunpowder, and China was the leader of so many different aspects. And when you have a 5,000-year history, as does India, it's a very complex one. To try and look through that history and ascertain what are the really important aspects is challenging. But if you look at the first 3 dates that I've entered and historic timelines, they all talk to foreign invasion of the country, very similar to what we saw in India. And this impacts very much on the psyche of the country. So the Mongols conquered Chinese under Kublai Khan. The Opium Wars, where the British and the French, in particular the British, are trying to force the Chinese to take the opium, which they don't want to do, leads to a war. The Chinese lose that war. They lose many wars. You'll see the next one, Hong Kong takes over control of Beijing. Sorry, Britain takes control of Beijing and Hong Kong. Only recently to return Hong Kong to the Chinese. 1949, I bold a defining year in the country, absolute defining. Founding of the People's Republic of China by Mao Zedong, the picture on the right, and there's a picture of his red book. You had to learn that book. You had to know that book off by heart. The creation of Taiwan, this fight that takes place between the communists and the nationalists. The nationalists lose the fight. They go to Taiwan and they create their own state, which obviously China does not recognize then and does not recognize now. 1958, Mao Zedong talks about the great leap forward. The way he changes the industrial system, he brings in the 5-year plans. The consequence of the great leap forward, terrible famines, and estimated 40 million people die. Almost as many people as died in the whole of the Second World War. This was not a great leap forward. It was a great leap backwards. And that changes with his death and Deng Xiaoping coming to power. In 1978, he introduces what they call the open door policy. And China, for the first time in many thousands of years, is reintroduced to the world. And from then on, better growth starts to come to the fore and better things. They also introduced the one-child policy, which has some implications that we're feeling now. But that was introduced back in 78, 79. Tiananmen Square, we had a wonderful young tour guide who took us around. We spoke about the Tiananmen Square massacre. Well, he spoke about the accident that took place. So kind of interesting the way one changes the terminology. 2001 is a sign that China has now rejoined the global economy, joins the World Trade Organization. 2008, they have Olympics. 2010, China overtakes Japan as the world's largest economy. They must really have enjoyed that moment. So out of that, we come up with the 2 national scars. The first is foreign dominance. And the interesting aspect, because China is so big and so populous and so powerful, is why does it happen? How can it happen? And a lot of it is because of internal divisions. A very undivided country, very much like India. 28 different states in India that the British, in fact, had to cobble together. Otherwise, actually very weakened. And secondly, obviously, the whole impact of the Chinese Communist Party. In our Russia presentation, we talk about the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and how that brings the Communist Party to power there and the implications of that. This is 32 years later. They watch what happens in Russia. They follow much of what's done. But a lot of what they do is internally focused to try to sort out this internal stability. So they have the largest standing army in the world, the People's Liberation Army, 2.2 million people strong. That is not to defend its borders outwards. It does that as well, and it's fought sometimes with India and Kashmir, etc. It's to maintain internal stability and discipline. Its first and foremost purpose is internal. And this whole theme then plays its well through. Everyone knows about the Great Wall of China, which Rasiba and I climbed, and we need to talk about that. But it talks to this fear of foreign dominance. Longest man-made structure in the world, over 9,000 kilometers long, but it was built to keep foreigners out. How much of China's 5,000-year history is about keeping people out, especially people who want to invade them? And Russia and India, it's a very challenging part of the world, as is Asia. 1 million lives were lost. They call it the world's longest cemetery, and that's important too, because China will happily sacrifice, if they have to, 1 million people or 10 million people for a greater good. There are 80 million odd people who are Communist Party members in a country of 1.3 billion. So it's actually a very small proportion of the population. And at that level, there's no democracy. If you read Chinese discussions around it, they have a democratic system. And from the Central Committee and up, they certainly do. Votes take place. And as long as you're a member of the Communist Party, we can vote you in or out. So the Central Committee has 371 members, 25 at the Politburo. But it's the Politburo Standing Committee of 7 members that control the country. And one of the ways they implement and ensure things take place was captured in a book called The Party, written by Richard McGregor. The bottom quote I thought was beautiful. He says, the party is like God. He is everywhere, you just can't see him. They call it the Great Firewall. The legal system is controlled. In many cases, the The outcome of the legal case is already predetermined by the Communist Party, and they implement it strongly. China has a minimum of 1,000 executions per annum. And many of these are staged and managed. When someone gets taken down in a corruption trial, there's typically a message behind it. You need to know that he has upset someone very senior, and a statement is being put out. They estimate by 2030 that 25% of the entire population is going to be elderly. We've spoken about this in terms of, for example, Japan as well. They say that they sell more nappies, diapers, to the elderly than they do to young kids as a consequence of some of the changes. And that has big implications for the labor force. In 2011, 2012, for the first time ever, 3.5 million people net left their labor force. They spoke there about exporting jobs to the rest of Asia because they're short of people, and wages are rising very, very sharply, which is also quite good because it is rebalancing that economy, and that is an important aspect too. And the consequence of huge numbers, unfortunately, one of them, our sustainability theme, is pollution. The most polluted cities in the world sit in India. The second most polluted are Beijing and Shanghai. But because it is so evident, there are X number of days a year that in Shanghai or Beijing you're not allowed outside. It's too dangerous to go outside. It's become politically very sensitive, and the party is doing something about it. They talk about spending $275 billion to remedy this over the next 5 years. They are closing down some of their coal plants. They're investing heavily into solar energy. Al Gore and other talks about progress that is being made by China. The CIBA was sitting with one of these officials at the dinner, and they said, we are taught at school from when we were young, Africa is your friend. Now, they also are doing some stuff in Africa, colonializing, damaging some of the resources, etc. But nevertheless, at the heart of it, we came out with a slightly different narrative. Not the Western one saying they're always bad, but actually one that says we want to help Africa out. We've seen South African companies go to Australia and typically struggle, and American typically struggle, including Discovery, for example. But some have been incredibly successful, in particular Naspers. It's the poster child of what happens, and it's a potential superpower. So it's not one to be ignored. And we talk about the fact that very soon it may well overtake the US in terms of the size of its economy.